The stunning cascade of events in Russia this weekend, from the Wagner Group's rebellion against Vladimir Putin to Yevgeny Prigozhin's sudden halt in his mercenary group's advance towards Moscow, took Washington and the world by surprise. President Biden is keeping a close eye on the situation, a situation that saw a nation with a massive nuclear stockpile pull back from the brink of a potential civil war. Earlier this morning, I spoke to Democratic Senator Chris Coons of Delaware, member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Senator Coons, welcome back to the Sunday Show. Were you surprised by what happened in Russia over the last 48 hours?
Jonathan, frankly, I was shocked. It was no secret that there was long-running tension between Prigozhin, the leader of the Wagner Group, a brutal mercenary organization that Putin has long supported, and the Minister of Defense, the Chief of Staff of the regular army. Prigozhin and Minister Shoigu have traded barbs back and forth, and for months, Prigozhin has threatened to take matters into his own hands or has insisted on the independence of his Wagner fighting force. They were critical to the win in Bakhmut that was at an unfortunate, very, very painful and bloody cost for the Russians and the Ukrainians. But for him to turn and send his forces into Russia to attack and occupy the Southern Military Command of the Russian military, and then to send his troops on the road up to Moscow and only stop when they were 120 miles from Russia's capital city. Jonathan, that was simply shocking. This is the biggest challenge to Putin in 20 years.
You know, to pick up on your point, the Washington Post is reporting this morning that U.S. intelligence learned a couple weeks ago about Prigozhin's plans for insurrection and briefed the White House, Pentagon, State Department, and Congress. Senator, were you privy to such intelligence? And if so, and I think I know the answer to this, did what happened exceed what you were told?
Jonathan, that's not something I can talk to you about generally or specifically. But I'm not one of the first people in Congress who's briefed on the highest levels of intelligence. So I'll say this. There was no surprise that there's a long-running tension between Prigozhin and the leadership of the military. And look, Wagner is well known for being brutal. What they've done in Central Africa, what they've done in Syria, these are thugs and war criminals. But that he would turn on his own country and threaten to attack Putin, that was shocking to me, even if there may be others who were briefed about that in advance.
Senator, part of the deal that led Prigozhin to abandon his rebellion was that he would go into exile in Belarus. Do you believe that Prigozhin, given he's the leader of a mercenary group, and as you said, you know, the leader of a band of thugs, chief thug among them, that he will follow through and actually go into exile?
He is completely unpredictable. He is also a creature and a creation of Vladimir Putin's. It's been useful for Putin to have a separate military force that he could use against Crimea in 2014, that he could use to set up the troll farms that interfered in our 2016 elections. Prigozhin rose from being a corner hot dog seller to a chef to Putin's chef, to someone who was doing all sorts of useful but very bad things for Putin over decades now. And what he's known for is his boldness, his aggression, and his unpredictability. So I don't have confidence that he'll keep to this deal, and I don't think anyone has clarity about what happens next.
Senator, let's talk more about Vladimir Putin. Former U.S. Ambassador to Russia, Michael McFaul, had some strong words about Putin's future. Listen.
I don't think it was a stunt. I think it was a mutiny. I think he can survive this, but he is much weaker today than he was just 24 hours ago.
Senator Coons, do you agree? Is Putin weaker than he was 24 hours ago?
Absolutely. Russia's political system is one where leaders going back to the czars were relied upon secret police, upon terrorizing their population, upon ruling with an iron fist. And it was stunning to me that in his address to the nation Saturday, Putin referenced the developments of 1917. Every Russian knows that after a military adventure in the First World War that ended in absolute disaster in 1914 in the Battle of Tannenbaum, when nearly 70,000 Russian soldiers were encircled and killed or captured by the Germans in just a few days, that's what precipitated the fall of Tsar Nicholas II. And for Putin to cite that as the reason that he was going to respond to Wagner's provocation ruthlessly is an indication of just how vulnerable Putin feels. And that's also a reminder that when he's created these different centers of power and played them off against each other, he only remains at the top of that pyramid of power as long as none of them seems to be able to successfully attack him. The Wagner troops got strikingly close to Moscow.
So then, Senator, given all of this and the unpredictability of Prigozhin, what are you going to be watching for over the next 24, 48 hours?
I would welcome an intelligence briefing on whether there was any indication that some elements of the police, the National Guard, the armed forces, the special forces, the security forces of Russia hesitated to come to Putin's defense. And frankly, I'll be looking for Ukraine to take advantage of this distraction and this opportunity. It's also a moment where, frankly, Jonathan, I'm more grateful than ever that our President Joe Biden is someone with decades of experience in world affairs. He knew not to insert himself, not to comment or tweet about this matter as his predecessor would have, but instead held a series of quick, calm, purposeful consultations with our core NATO allies and with those who've stood shoulder to shoulder with us and with Ukraine. Frankly, Jonathan, one of the key reasons that this happened was the success of President Biden's leadership in pulling together 40 countries to invest tens of billions of dollars in Ukraine's defense, and the brave and relentless way in which Ukrainians have been fighting to restore sovereignty, to kick out the Russian invaders. Wagner had a really, really hard time over the last 6 months. They lost thousands and thousands of fighters. That's why the parallel to 1917 is so close, because the military disaster of the Russian Imperial Army in the First World War happened because of corruption in their military, bad logistics, and poor morale. That's also what's happening on the front lines to Russian troops. And one of the things I'll be looking for is whether or not this weakness, not just in Russia's military, but in Putin, creates an opening for Ukraine to fight their way back to recovering control of all of their territory.